Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. Today I have Adam Dent, who will be going through a presentation on the trust, customer experience, and outcomes. And before I hand over to Adam, I'll just give a quick bio. So Adam was appointed Chief Executive and member of the board of the New South Wales State Insurance Regulatory Authority in July 2021. Adam is an accomplished Chief Executive and transformational change leader with substantial experience in personal leadership, business improvement, and change in government, the public sector, and non-profit organizations. He is a strategic leader who builds strong, positive, and sustainable relationships with stakeholders and clients. As CEO of the New South Wales Trustee and Guardian, Adam supported over 35,000 customers annually and managed in excess of $6 billion in client assets. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks, Danny. That's good to be here. So, as Danny just introduced, I've been with Xero only a number of months now, just coming up to 4 months. So relatively new to the State Insurance Regulatory Authority here in New South Wales, and therefore to the motor accident and workers' compensation schemes. But in my previous role at Trustee and Guardian here in New South Wales, obviously very much exposed to both, but also the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So I think from that premise, today what I wanted to focus on was a conversation a little bit about trust generally in the types of organisations and schemes that we're a part of, and then share with you some of the outcomes of our more recent work around customer experience and outcomes at Xero. We published a baseline study a little while ago, but now we've done some more work on that, and it's a longitudinal piece of work. So I want to take you through some of the learnings we've had from that today as they relate to personal injury schemes here in New South Wales. So I'll kick off, first of all, talking about trust generally. For those of you who are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, apologies for sharing something you might have seen, but those who haven't necessarily kept track of that, Edelman each year publish a trust sentiment survey globally, and they look at it across 4 main domains: government, NGOs, media, and business, and they measure it both through the view of the informed public and the mass population. Now, informed public are generally described as those between sort of 26 and 60 with a university education and employment, full-time employment at a particular salary grade. So it's a fairly specific subset. But then they also measure the mass population's view of trust. Interestingly, when we normally talk about trust, over the last number of years, there's been, the reports have been titled Trust in Crisis and a range of things like that. Obviously, over the last 2 years, we've gone through a very different period, particularly here in Australia. And so what's been interesting is that we're now seeing record levels of trust among, in particular, the informed public. So you can see where the things are blue there on the screen. That has indicated they've gone into trust territory. Where they're that sort of shade of bluey grey, they're still neutral or distrust in others. So just looking at this, for example, at the moment, you can see that the mass population does not trust media at this point in time in 2021. They're neutral on all 3 other domains, but the informed public are overall trusting this year. So that's been a record high and a record rise over the last 2 years. We've obviously learned to have a great deal more trust in institutions as we've lived through the pandemic that we've been through. Now, while there's a lot of nuance in who might be in each segment of the population and the degree of trust that might be experienced by each segment, it is interesting to see that in the main, the informed public are now actually quite trusting of the main sort of descriptors of institutions in Australia. So it's a huge increase on last year. But what's really important is that gap between the mass population and informed public. So at the moment, we're seeing trust probably off the back of our need for trust in government in particular and the media over the course of the pandemic. But how long that's sustainable will be interesting. It is at record highs, and I think like everything, it won't take long for it to potentially disappear. Edelman also talk about trust in terms of those four groups about whether they're considered competent and ethical. And for the first time in some time, government in particular, so from my point of view, the schemes that we work in are now considered competent, but still haven't crossed the threshold into ethical, which is interesting in and of itself. But up until recently in Australia, we basically saw most of those 4 categories, bar NGOs who were on the edge, as being not competent and not necessarily ethical. So it is a good thing. I think it's positive to see trust increasing in this way. The question will be how long we can sustain results quite like this. particularly once we get now through what hopes to be the opening up of most of Australia, and perhaps the sort of the beginning of whatever that new normal might look like for us, and then potentially the views of those who may not have felt, particularly over the last 2 years, that their needs have been met. Those views will start to become into focus, and we might see trust disappear. Now, trust is an important thing, I think, particularly in the types of environment we work. And the key reason I say that is that where somebody doesn't have a choice but to engage with a scheme or government or an agency in some way, where they're left with that as their only option, it becomes inherent and implicit that that organisation has the responsibility to build the trust. So trust is earned, and there are many ways you can do that where there is choice and people get to make choices based on whether they trust an organisation or not. In our schemes, in the work that we do, I feel it's incumbent upon insurers, on regulators, on service providers to be aware of what it takes to build and disassemble trust, and be proactive in that, because the people who are customers of these schemes don't have the choices that we would otherwise necessarily have. So I think trust becomes really, really critical. If you look into the personal injury schemes, our work at our baseline study more recently within CIRA found that just over half of claimants actually trust schemes to get them back to work or activity, but this does decline over time. And so our more recent longitudinal work has shown that, which is an interesting result to have discovered through this process. Now, the majority of people do return back to work or activity or report life being back on track, but with lower trust as a backdrop. So we can see here that across the compulsory third-party scheme, 53% of claimants believe the scheme would help them get back to work or usual activities, and 60% of workers' compensation claimants agreed they trusted the scheme to get them back to work or activities. So realistically, we're saying the best part of half don't necessarily believe as they enter the schemes that things are going to work out well for them, or do they trust the schemes? We'll get to some more specific results of how that changes over time shortly. I just wanted to stop though for a moment and focus on, and apologies for the awful graphic, I just couldn't make something nicer pop up, but the three elements that a number of studies have come together to say make up institutional trust. So these are the three areas of focus that I think if we all put some energy into, we would go a long way to being able to more easily build trust in either our schemes, our organisations, or the areas that we represent. Their competence, benevolence, and integrity. Now, a number of the studies call competence ability. They're used interchangeably. General Mayer did this in 1995, and it's been enduring, and it's been quoted and readdressed a number of times. So competence refers to both your legal authority, but then ability to actually deliver the service that you say you're going to be able to deliver. And while it sounds relatively simple, somebody's belief or ability to gain the information to know that you are both competent and capable and legally available to do the work is a really critical first piece in the puzzle. Benevolence refers to the ability for the customer to see that they believe you're acting in their best interests. They believe you have a motivation other than profit in order to do work and good work for them. And then integrity becoming the more obvious one is your capacity to deliver on what you say, and to do that with appropriate motivations. So those three elements together will build institutional trust. Competence is obviously a very early measure. That's the one that somebody would need to see almost initially to form a judgment of either a scheme or an institution or an organisation. And benevolence would build over time. So that perception that you are acting in their interests is something that you need to continually work on and maintain in order for the balance of trust to continue. And integrity obviously becomes essentially the deal breaker one way or another if that's not met. So those three elements together are something that if you were to focus on in every organisation, the research points to the fact that you will build and be able to maintain trust. And you could almost essentially use it as a bit of a template, in terms of as you're producing publications or materials, have you demonstrated competence? Is it clear that this is in the customer's interest, so benevolence? And what are you providing in terms of further details and make sure they understand that you will carry through on your actions? A fairly simple sort of three-step formula that actually has the best chance of helping you build and maintain trust. At CIRA, we look through another lens, though, but it is related. Our 5 customer service conduct principles that we expect insurers to maintain and each year ask them to attest to speak to each of these three things relatively neatly. So the first is about being efficient and easy to engage. The second, acting fairly with empathy and respect. The third being to resolve concerns quickly, respect customers' time and be proactive. The fourth is having the systems in place and identifying and addressing customer concerns, and the fifth being about being accountable for actions and honest interactions with customers. When you think about the key sort of message behind each of those 5 customer service conduct principles, you see pretty quickly that the first two relate reasonably well to competence. The second two are the customer-focused elements, which relate to benevolence, and of course the fifth coming in to looks at integrity. So those 5 things that we use in New South Wales as our conduct principles across personal injury schemes relate neatly to essentially the ingredients that build trust. So if an insurer was to actively address and implement those 5 things, they have a greater chance of building trust. Now, that we see over 50% of people start off from a place of trust is positive, but obviously says there's more work to be done. Over the last year, CIRA was engaged, commencing in 2019, so it's sort of a bit of a funny 2-year period where it all blurs into one really, but commissioned in 2019 and over the course of 2020. So CIRA engaged the Social Research Centre to undertake a study for us into customer trust and experience of this personal injury schemes. There were 3 key areas we focused on. The first being their trust in the scheme, and we understand this is probably the first time that trust has been measured in a personal injury scheme in Australia. We think it's really important because it is so critical to getting good outcomes. So we're really proud of having been able to do that work and to get a baseline study, which was delivered through surveys in June and July 2020, relating to people who had experienced the injury schemes between April 2019 and March 2020. So over the course of a year period, we selected 893 people with CTP claims and 885 in workers' compensation schemes. We measured trust, we measured return to work or activity, and the extent to which people felt that their life was back on track. Importantly, it certainly wasn't just CIRA picking up the phone. We used the Social Research Centre as an independent researcher to add credibility to the work we were doing and a degree of arm's length. While we are the regulator, it made sense to actually have an organisation that has critical experience in this area and could speak to customers in an appropriate way to give them the sense that they were being spoken to confidentially to get the best outcomes. We made sure we really delivered the customer voice. So there was a survey, there were a series of focus groups and case studies. So the longitudinal element focused on focus groups and case studies, and there was a larger survey at the front end. The methodology was robust. It was developed and endorsed with academic review. The scales were validated. We had the representative samples, as you saw there, so in close to 1,000 in each scheme, and we did the follow-up at 3 and 9 months, which the results I'll take you through. But so just in terms of the total numbers, as we followed through the scheme, around 300 people participated in all phases of the CTP work, and about 234 through the entire workers' compensation scheme period. So at each level, picking up a few less people, and obviously as their journeys were varied throughout the course of the scheme. So at the baseline, a fairly significant number to get that starting point, and then at 3 and 9 months, reduced numbers, but a deeper level of engagement to get the sort of more nuanced results. So at the 6 and 9 months, we learned a couple of really interesting things. So in terms of trust, you can see on the screen there that within CTP and workers' compensation, the pattern seemed fairly similar, although within the CTP scheme, slightly lower scores. But at the baseline, 53 and 60%. At the 3-month point, trust increased to 59 and 64, but the longer somebody stayed in the schemes, trust started to decline and got below the base level of trust. Within return to work and activity, the majority of people, results improved. More people were reporting that they had or were on track to return to work or activity. And similarly, you'll see, well, there's a little blip on workers' compensation at the bottom. The extent to which people perceived that life was back on track increased over time. So outcomes were looking positive and improving over time, but trust in the scheme wasn't. And I think that's an interesting observation. So we've learned a little through that. First of all, that the length of time in the scheme is likely to reduce trust. The research also found that those having symptoms of probable serious mental illness had reduced trust over their experience, and those experiencing moderate to severe pain also demonstrated a lower sense of trust as they progressed throughout the scheme. There are a number of unrelated factors that didn't relate to injury type or severity that also played a role in this. The first being reciprocity, so insurer trusting claimants being treated with suspicion. Secondly, the level of support from claims managers and consultants, and clear, straightforward paths with accessible information. And the final area that demonstrated the non-injury related reductions in trust were around access to advocacy and support networks, legal, industrial, medical, and social. So all those things came together to basically reduce trust. There was also issues we picked up around procedural burdens of the process that I think were really interesting to know, and particularly for those with psychological injuries or experiencing psychological distress, that ability to navigate the system and deal with the procedural burdens led straight to a reduction in that sense of trust. In a related way, the ability of a claimant or claimant's capacity to discover information autonomously about the process and to develop a better understanding of the process and their rights throughout the process also, and or indeed their obligations, led to that reduction in trust. What also came out of the issues was around the idea that insurers not trusting the client at all. So they felt they're often treated, as I said before, with suspicion. So things like independent investigations and not taking the claimant's doctor's advice impacted trust. The onus of proof being on the claimant. Claimants where they were deemed at fault, or in workers' compensation issues where they were in complex or contentious workplace situations, reduced trust. If they were part of a disagreement or complication around pre-existing injuries, or where there was a perceived lack of sensitivity around psychological injury, all of those factors played into reducing trust. Overall, the quality of research basically told us that people didn't trust that the process was set up to meaningfully support their recovery, and that they needed to constantly prove the legitimacy of their injury and their treatment needs. That was more prevalent, though, again, around those experiencing psychological injuries. Noteworthy was also that claimants who had a language other than English often found it challenging to understand the correspondence that was provided. They didn't always feel comfortable to follow up and clarify issues with their insurer, and felt that they didn't receive sufficient language support to navigate the process effectively. So some really deep and sort of critical insights into the overall process there. In terms of what can be done, a number of things emerged as the needs from participants' point of view. Of course, not all can be delivered, but the types of things that participants suggested would increase the sense of trust included increasing benefits, treatment, and services, being more helpful and compassionate or understanding, so sort of customer centricity type focus, better consideration and assessment of injuries, and more communication, contact, and follow-up. So those four things were the key elements reported by participants in the scheme that would help improve trust. As I said, obviously, increasing benefits doesn't necessarily become an easy task, but that sense of somebody being able to address and meet and have experience of their entitlements being properly met is critical, and the sense of having to justify treatments plays into it. So I think certainly there's an element around expectation management and communication that could improve that sense, which also came through in that idea of being more helpful and compassionate and understanding. So the sorts of suggestions that come, when you frame those in a slightly different way, would be a more person-focused approach by insurers prioritising the recovery journey and overall well-being of a claimant, more consistency and quality of case management and in workplace rehabilitation, greater discretion for treating doctors and health providers in the claims process with better integration across the board, looking at holistic support options and systems, particularly where it relates to psychological injury and distress, improving information sharing and proactive explanation of the claims process. So that's sharing between insurers and providers, the claimant, and then the overall process being something that's more easy to explain or understand for a claimant. So they're not trying to navigate it in a sense on their own in what might seem a more adversarial environment than perhaps it necessarily needs to be. Other insights included sort of improved mechanisms or systems for internal reviews where somebody did have a disagreement or a misunderstanding about the process, having clearer avenues for support and advocacy services to help empower claimants. Language support, as I mentioned before, particularly for those who speak another language other than English at home. And really critically, and I mentioned just then, support for claimants to set realistic expectations about their treatment and recovery without knowing what's possible or what's reasonable or what rights and entitlements somebody has. Potentially that the trust is eroded by virtue of the claimant not necessarily understanding what's actually available. One of the key other lessons to emerge out of this really is that building trust starts with moving faster. Resolving a person's quickly and early identification of probable mental illness or significant pain will go a long way on the basis that they are the claimants who are most likely to have a lower degree of trust. So identification of those issues early on allows a more proactive response that may be more tailored and to drive the right outcomes for those individual participants. So if we think about the two key areas of our customer service conduct principles that would be the most relevant, that would be resolving concerns quickly, respecting customers' time and being proactive, and having the systems in place to identify and address customer concerns. In this case, possible mental illness or significant pain. Those things hone in very quickly on benevolence, which is that concept of being more customer-centric. So if our schemes were to be driven inherently from a customer-centric basis, we'd have a greater chance of building trust from the outset. So this work for us has been groundbreaking. It's going to continue. At this stage, the results will be published shortly. Our insurers have seen them. We've published the baseline results are available on the CIRA website. There's obviously a great deal more detail than I might have been able to get through today in terms of the outcomes. But those really key issues of understanding that trust starts strong and declines, despite that in the main, the same participants were experiencing improving outcomes over the longitudinal period. The next steps for us in terms of where we're taking this program, we've made the decision this will be an ongoing program as its form might change gradually to meet the needs of participants, but we've decided this is absolutely certainly something we want to measure continuously across the 3 schemes that CIRA administers here in New South Wales. We're going to broaden the research questions to take into account the overall customer experience. So you saw at the start there was those 3 focuses on trust, people's outcomes and likelihood of recovery, and that sense of getting life back on track. What we want to do is take that across the entire customer service conduct principles spectrum and analyse the overall experience from start to finish, but maintaining those 3 key measures we've already looked at, with trust being a critical one for us. We will look at additional cohorts. So as I've said, we'll look at all schemes. To date, we've looked at CTP and workers' compensation. In New South Wales, CIRA also looks after the home building compensation scheme. We also have a small role in lifetime care and dust diseases schemes. Nevertheless, we want to look at a broader number of the breadth of those schemes. We'll also start looking at the results with health providers as well. So all of the entities that CIRA has a role in regulating will be looking to measure the customer experience and trust across those. We're looking to also start data matching with claims data, having some flexibility around the questions, and moving to a more frequent program than we currently have, looking at how we can get more frequent, more valuable insights to help us actually with our supervision role and provide better feedback to insurers and providers along the way about the experiences we're getting. We're going to move the focus to being on customer stories and journey mapping. Apologies for the typo there. And really importantly, CIRA is committed to our open data portal and publishing as much useful information as we can about our schemes. So we want to move to being able to ingest and visualize as much data as possible that relates to these surveys and to the overall schemes, so that we can provide a richer and more transparent picture to participants, to insurers, and to service providers across the schemes to understand and see what is happening and where improvement is being seen on the basis of the work that we've done. So that's essentially where I'll finish the presentation now. I've got some time for questions. I can see that one that's already popped through by the look of it, so I might just take that off the screen. And Danny, back to chatting to you. And we get the classic. I think you might be on mute.
There you go. It's got to happen once a day, right?
Exactly.
Thank you for that, Adam. I think that was a really interesting presentation, and really great to see that CIRA is bringing that voice of customer into its thinking. Often I think in workers' comp and CTP, there's just so many stakeholders that are involved that sometimes they drown out the voice of the customer, and really that's what the scheme is there for. So thank you for that. Yes, we do have a question here from David. We'll pop it onto the screen. Are there any findings you found particularly surprising?
David, thanks for the question. Look, so what I'll do is at this point confess that being 3.5, 4 months in at CIRA, I didn't find anything particularly surprising because I learned all of this for the first time as we started seeing the results. I would suggest my colleagues may have a different answer. I think what is really interesting, perhaps rather than surprising, is that the decline in trust as it related to an improvement in outcomes being reported. So I think that's an interesting one to understand, that the longer somebody's in the scheme, the less they trust the scheme, despite that results getting better. So that tells you there's a real customer experience issue, that irrespective of the outcomes they're achieving through being in the scheme, the longer they're with the scheme, the less they feel good about it, and the less they're convinced that a good outcome will come for them. So I think that's probably concerning more than maybe surprising, but certainly very interesting that that's an issue that we've picked up, and speaks to that need, I think, from CIRA's point of view, to continue working on the customer service conduct principles and making sure we have a consistent approach to really putting the claimant at the centre of the process.
Thanks for that, Adam. I think that does reinforce other research that's also shown that people who are in compensation type schemes, unfortunately, do experience lower levels of positive customer experience or even health outcomes. So I think that your research is reinforcing that. If we go back to the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about trust in governments and potentially government institutions being at an all-time high. I wonder, coming out of the pandemic now and we're moving to a different sort of stage, do you have any thoughts on what you think governments or schemes or government institutions needs to continue to do to kind of really maintain that level of trust moving forward?
Look, I'm certainly not going to try and speak for Edelman, but I think if you consider that over the last 2 years, the really key thing that we've seen quite different is the volume of communication, and the level at which governments have gone to extraordinary trouble to put experts on the screen and have them standing with them. And I think if you in any of the states and territories around Australia, but certainly here in New South Wales, we saw Dr. Kerry Chant next to the Premier every morning. The same has happened in both Queensland and Victoria. I assume in the other states, there's only so many news stories you can watch of a morning. But I think that transparency of expert opinion has really, I think, driven that ability for you to see something in the media that's effectively instantly fact-checked by the expert being in front of you, and knowing that it's coming with a degree of regularity and transparency has probably driven a fairly significant increase in trust for us. So I think the lesson there really is, how do we continue to do that? I think if you look at other times where Australia's experienced crisis, the things that have driven community trust have been the same sorts of things. So during the bushfires in New South Wales 2 years ago, Shane Fitzsimmons was a feature on everyone's television every single day, standing next to the Premier. And again, around Australia, you look at every time there's a crisis, there's an expert standing there providing you with clear, transparent and honest information. And there've even been examples, not even, I shouldn't sound that surprised, but there've been plenty of examples of politicians who have absolutely got it right in crisis by being open, transparent, and I think upfront with people with regularity. So I think when things are difficult and people communicate well, that naturally builds trust. The challenge then is when nothing devastating is going on, and when we're not in a global pandemic anymore, how do we continue to create that sense of trust in government without that sort of mainstream material every day? I think that probably then puts the onus back on those of us working in government. And when I say government, I mean, I think in terms of the context of the people who join us here today, across anyone working in and around the schemes that we're working with, I think trust comes from that transparency and openness. So how do we then build that into our day-to-day operating is really the big question for us. For CIRA, that's about our open data portal. It's about sharing actively. And I think the same would then be a consideration for anybody else.
On the portal, I think there is another question here from David on, in terms of customer stories, is the idea to publish those on the website? Are they intended to provide benchmarks for other claimants?
Certainly, our view would be, as we assemble those and with the right consent, we'd like to. I'm committed that I think as a regulator, we've got a job to tell a story about the whole system that we're in. So our aim would absolutely be to do that as we gather those. So shifting that focus to being more about customer stories will be with that intent.
Okay, thank you. A question here from Sue Freeman. So wondering, are you comparing the results by insurer agent? Are some insurers or agents delivering better customer experiences than others?
So yes, we are, and obviously that I wasn't quite as keen to share all of that today. So we absolutely have seen there are insurers that perform better than others, but in different elements, certainly as it relates to customer experience. So that now, this data is also not just, I guess, for us to publish. It really was also to inform our supervision approach with insurers. So there are considerable similarities across some, not necessarily that they were all delivering out of the park exceptional service. So, but there was sort of consistency across some of those key areas. But we have got that level of granularity. We do know that around workers' compensation, we regularly measure across classes of insurers, and we know that there are both classes or individual insurers that perform better than others. So this data gives us a sort of a deeper level of granularity than we've had before about the customer perspective, rather than, I suppose, just the claims data that's in front of us each week. So we will continue to really drive that down and get as granular as possible.
I guess building on that, what has the reception been? If you've had the conversations, what has the reception been from insurers? And I imagine they do their own sort of customer research. And how do you kind of integrate what you're doing with maybe what they're seeing to get a different perspective?
I think the key thing for us is we've gone to a level of depth that I think is probably so far unusual. So we've moved beyond net promoter scores and the sort of generic customer satisfaction tools and really focused in on that element of trust. So that's where this is certainly varied. And in the main, I mean, this is valuable for insurers. What we're doing is providing them a level of insight that they might not have otherwise seen before. Despite being the regulator, I don't actually believe anyone is out there with nefarious intent trying to do the wrong thing by a claimant. So I know insurers will value having that greater degree of insight. And I think from our point of view, a more targeted approach to our supervision work as a regulator will be more useful to insurers. So I think it's a net positive. I think the more we're talking about what really matters to people and the multiple perspectives at which we can approach it as a regulator from a different perspective than an insurer might with a customer, I think the more we bring that richness to it, the better outcomes we're going to see across our schemes. And realistically, CIRA's goal is to see the best possible outcomes for injured people and policyholders and sustainable schemes. So I think it's all just a bigger ingredient to a picture that we're all fighting for, that both the regulators and insurers and the policyholders all want to see better outcomes.
Thank you. Yes, I imagine some level of competition between insurers is also good there, where they can see that they're either better or worse than the rest of the industry. So that
Absolutely,
that helps as well.
A little bit of competition never hurt anybody.
We have a question here from Fiona Cameron. Anything more you can tell us about the differences between CTP and workers' comp? We did see there's a little bit of a difference there in the customer satisfaction levels between the schemes. Any views on why that may be, or any other differences you might want to point out?
And I'll confess at this point that to hand I don't have the sort of the nuance. Some of it was somewhat nuanced, so there are some subtle differences. When it was 53 versus 60% of the baseline, and they followed a similar trend of going back, sort of improving and then declining. So I think what was probably interesting is there was actually a lot of similarity across the two schemes, and then there was a degree of difference that sort of formed, but I haven't got anything specific in front of me. Psychological injury and workers' compensation was probably a key driver of difference, whereas the issues around severe pain were possibly more prevalent in CTP. But Fiona, I'd probably love to suggest that when we publish the rest of the detail, you'll find it, and you'll get more than you'll get from me.
In terms of other providers, I mean, there's a lot of other people who are will be engaged or will interact with injured people. Is there any views on CIRA taking some of these results or insights to those other stakeholders and sharing that with them as well?
Well, certainly, particularly as we work across the spectrum of providers, so we also regulate people in the sort of the health space rather than just the claims management space. So we'll certainly be sharing this with anyone who will listen. Our commitment to transparency means we're publishing as much information as possible over time on our website. So we'd certainly be keen to and happy to engage with anybody who is absolutely interested. If you're not part of our normal consultative process, so the information will be on the CIRA website. Please take the time to have a look at that. But certainly now a regulatory approach across all of the stakeholders that we work with will be sharing this information. I think it's great that it's groundbreaking. There's considerably more detail within our scheme policy teams than I'm able to imagine pulling together into a short presentation. So that richness is something we'd be looking to take to anybody who's prepared to work with us.
Thank you, Adam. And maybe a last question from me. In terms of where this goes, is this a regular sort of occurrence for Xero? How do you kind of continue to embed this voice of the customer into your operations?
So as part of our ongoing strategy, bringing the voice of customer into our regulatory activity is a critical piece of the puzzle for us. So the next step is we'll do another round very, very shortly. So we're just engaging providers now to continue this existing process while we look at how we evolve the process into being something that is longer term and more frequent. So we had a baseline 3 and 9 month point. We're going to go back and do another sample very shortly, but we want to look at how we can get a rolling program of feedback. I won't use the word real time, obviously, but sort of what we want to be doing is having a regular approach so that we can be publishing something far more frequently. So I think you'll see this will be now a standard part of our overall approach and the conversation we have with the community about what we're seeing across schemes.
That's great. We have got another question here from Nadine King. Have you considered the application of this work to your funding customers?
I'm probably not sure I fully understand the question, Nadine, actually. So I'd be happy to have you check in with me offline.
Yeah, sorry, I can't provide any further context on that. So if there aren't any more further questions, I'm happy to end the session there. Thank you for your time, Adam. I think it was
Danny,
really
my
great
pleasure.
to hear this work that's being done by Xero.
And we look forward to sharing more of it over time. Thanks very much.
Sounds great. Thank you.